roads are dying of old age.
And come every spring, the bottoms drop out.
Yep, you have to be careful driving the kids over these roads.
What's a citizen gonna do?
That was a clip from a genuine film that General Motors made in 1954. It was called Give Yourself the Green Light, and it was Hollywood quality propaganda about highways. It framed traffic as a national crisis that was destroying the American dream.
Made.
5 o'clock.
Car nearly paid for. So you get a little home in the suburbs, away from the city smoke, out from the shadows of the factory, into the sun and clean air. Raise a few kids, some flowers and vegetables. The big dream coming true. But it backfires into a pipe dream. Exhaust pipe dream. Every night it takes longer to get home, wasting more time in gasoline. No wonder everybody's acting so nervous. What's a citizen gonna do?
What can a citizen do?
To help find out, a Better Highways contest was recently conducted. Purpose? Arouse nationwide thinking on how to plan and pay for the safe and adequate highways we need.
As insane as this movie was, General Motors was not alone in making films like these. Ford made them, Dow Chemical made them. Basically, every company that sold cars or asphalt or tires turned themselves into production companies and made movies in the 1950s, movies selling Americans on the concept of highways. The reason was the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1956. Companies were either pushing for that $51 billion bill to pass, or they were trying to convince Americans to let them build highways through their neighborhoods once the bill did pass. And it worked. The bill passed. The legislation built 41,000 miles of new highway. Now, there's no doubt that the implementation of our country's new highway system was very often flawed, particularly since it often divided communities, especially those of color. But it became the largest public works project in the nation's history. It completely changed America. And now, today, with last year's Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and this week's Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration is attempting the biggest infrastructure transformation our country has seen since that act in 1956. Those pieces of legislation actually aim to correct some of the very real problems that the initial highway system imposed: the pollution, the carbon emissions, the destruction of primarily black and brown communities. The goals of this law are ambitious. They fund a national network of electric vehicle charging stations and encourage Americans to switch over to electric cars with tax credits. The laws try to make public transit good enough to convince Americans to maybe even get out of those cars that they sit in. Taken together, all of this could be another major shift for this country, but it is one that is going to have to be sold to the American public. And unlike in the 1950s, no mega corporations are pumping out well-produced films to help convince Americans that environmentally sustainable transit is a worthwhile investment. This time around, one of the main salesmen for this hugely transformational part of the Biden administration's agenda is Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Buttigieg has made a name for himself as one of the most effective communicators in the president's cabinet. Someone who's become known for his willingness and also his ability to speak to those across the political divide. But this time, he really has his work cut out for him, because attacking this part of Biden's agenda is the conservative media's bread and butter.
Let's start right at the top. Pete's Highway to Hell. That's the focus of tonight's angle.
And Mayor Pete is pushing electric cars on struggling Americans.
In November, he told Americans in rural areas, the poorest parts of this country, to go ahead and buy electric vehicles. Get a Prius, even though they cost more than 50 grand. And that same month, of course, he reminded us that our highways are racist. More recently, the Transportation Secretary has been telling us about the one thing that's going to fix our high fuel prices and clogged commercial airline travel. And that's, of course, abortion.
Like I said, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg has his work cut out for him. He joins us live, coming up next.
This is Pete Buttigieg, Biden's transportation secretary, seemingly out of touch with what it takes to own an electric vehicle in this country. Listen.
I'm still astonished that some folks, and I felt this, I was testifying in Congress yesterday, some folks seem to really struggle to let go of the status quo.
Struggle to let go of the status quo. Astonished that there isn't a bigger transition to EVs. You can put it up on the screen. The average cost of an electric vehicle in the United States today, Senator, we wrote it out, didn't round down or up. That is it. $66,997 for a new EV.
That was Fox News, the day after Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg testified before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee last month. If that Fox News host had listened to what Secretary Buttigieg had said in that hearing, she would know that he had already offered a counterpoint. You can buy a brand new, fully electric Chevy Bolt for $25,600 right now. And that doesn't even take into account how the Biden administration's new electric vehicle tax credits can be applied in the purchase of used cars. So, how does the Biden administration get past the relentless accusations and alarmism from the right? The man with that answer is joining us now. Pete Buttigieg, President Biden's Secretary of Transportation. Secretary, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for sharing that footage from the 50s. That's fascinating.
Well, we're fascinated by what has happened in America and what is coming to pass. But I got to ask you, because you've been kind of like the one-man band, or at least the loudest and most effective one-man band, in talking to the right, which has been highly resistant to renewables and electric vehicles. Do you think you are going to be able to convince the viewers of Fox News that what is happening here, what the Biden administration would like to do, and indeed what the country must do in this century, is move towards renewables? Do you think anyone is listening to the message that you have been offering on Fox News?
I think so. Look, obviously you have a political apparatus, an opinion apparatus of commentators, politicians trying to keep everything the same, trying to keep electric vehicles more expensive than they have to be, trying to keep people locked into yesterday's energy. But I think people are looking toward the future and looking for solutions. And, at a certain point, there's going to be a disconnect between these politicians and opinion hosts who, will go on a segment or a program like that, trying to get everybody to think that, an electric vehicle in this country starts at $66,000 when, those same viewers are going to watch the commercials during the commercial breaks and see what the prices are. And now, what they won't see is that we're fighting to get those prices lower, unless somebody like me is out there to talk about this. That's part of why, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act is going to benefit so many Americans. We're the ones fighting to make EVs cheaper because we know if we make them more affordable for more Americans, then more Americans can save at the pump. And of course, that's also going to help us build up a U.S.-made EV industry with American jobs, American soil, and American workers, all while helping us to fight climate change. I'm under no illusions that everybody here in Washington is coming to this conversation in good faith. But I'm also under no illusions that people who don't already agree with us are going to have any idea what our message is if we don't go out there and talk about it to anyone who will listen.
Yeah, and it's by no means is anyone trying to shame you for talking to Fox News or talking to Republicans, because that's part of the job, right? But it seems like you're battling something more than just the economics of this. This feels like a cultural battle as much as anything else. So much of the American myth-making revolves around the open road and the gas-powered engine. Those highway videos from the 1950s. Some people are still very much entrenched in that sort of thinking about what kind of country this is. And I wonder how you think you combat that, right? People want to hold on to this past of America that is no longer our present and certainly isn't going to be our future. But how do you get them to let go of what you call, I think perhaps euphemistically, the status quo? How do you think about your work in that vein?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to remember is if we want to be true to a tradition, we got to remember that tradition was about looking to the future. In other words, the best things about our past had to do with getting out of the past, and the worst things about our past are things we don't have to repeat. So when we're thinking about how not just roads but transportation in general should look going into the 2020s, 30s, 40s, making it work by the 2050s in a whole new way, it's not going to meet the needs of this country to have the mentality of the 1950s. We know better. In some ways we knew better then, but we definitely know better now when it comes to climate, when it comes to how our cities are laid out. Of course, there's a history to it. There's a romance to it. And some of that should be honored. Some of that will always be with us. The open road trips, always going to be an important part of what it is to live in America. But we also need to create more options for people, more opportunities for people, whether you live in a big city or a smaller community, with, for example, making it safer and easier to get around with public transit or on foot on a bike, so that whether you own a car or not, you don't always have to drag 2 tons of metal with you everywhere that you go. This is also an issue of equity. We've got to make sure that we have ways of organizing our infrastructure for the future that don't exclude people, or worse, divide or segregate, something that we've seen a lot of in this country, but there's no reason we have to do it all over again just because that's how things worked in the past.
I wonder politically how this is, how you guys are thinking about this moment, because it's obviously a huge piece of legislation for the president. And we've seen some increasingly positive numbers in the midterm races, or at least in the projections about the midterm races. I think there is a polling out today that has Democrats up by 4%, generally speaking, broadly in the Senate races that are happening this November. We have some Senate seats that look like they could go onto the Democratic side of the ledger. Raphael Warnock could keep his seat, Mark Kelly, John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin. Do you think this plays, does the IRA, does all of this play a role, or is it gas prices? I ask you because you're the transportation secretary and you have to think about gas prices. I mean, how much is this the sort of lofty proposition of new future vis-a-vis the Biden administration? And how much of this is just about people saying, oh, my gas is $3 a gallon, not $6?
I think people are looking around at how their lives are different, how they are shaped by forces around the world and political decisions made in Washington. That's one of the reasons gas prices is something that's on everybody's mind. Obviously, gas prices aren't controlled by any individual policymaker in Washington, but they're part of what it's like to live in the American economy, and they hold, Americans hold those in charge responsible for the overall conditions. And to some extent, we've leaned into that. The president took a lot of steps to help stabilize gas prices. Not that he controls them, but things like releasing the oil from the oil reserve was designed to bring some relief and breathing room and stability, and I think that's contributed to this fall in gas prices. I think what's going to be very important in talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and for that matter, the bipartisan infrastructure law that we're so excited to be implementing in my department, is not to get so hung up on talking about the legislative mechanism or the finer points of the policy, and really focus on the difference it's actually going to make. I mean, look at the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. Part of what that contains is lower prescription drug prices, and most people are on board with that. Think we should have done it a long time ago. It really was kind of the American people, the president, and Democratic Senate and House members on one side of this policy issue, Big Pharma and Republican Senate and House members on the other. But that's not how the American people lined up. I saw somewhere, I think something like 70% of Republicans out around the country think it's a good idea to let Medicare negotiate prescription drug prices, even if it got 0% support among Republican members of the House or the Senate when the vote came up. So talking about the specific thing that's going to make a difference in your life, whether it's a more affordable electric vehicle, whether it's more affordable prescription drugs, whether it's the tax credits that are going to help you make your house more energy efficient, save on your energy bills, or the fact that, right now, we are now able to announce improvements to ports, improvements to roads and bridges in neighborhoods around America, a whole new round of grants that we just rolled out that are going to benefit everything from airports to pedestrian crossings that people are feeling. And that's where I think we need to keep the focus.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I mean, what we're hearing on, for example, Fox News is, pablum about racist highways, which is, in typical Fox fashion, not actually accurate, to be euphemistic, and glosses over what is a really serious issue. We talk about this 1950s Highway Act, and what it did is pave through black and brown neighborhoods and destroyed communities of color. You guys are addressing that in the IRA, and I want to ask a little bit more about that. You've pledged $3 billion to remove some of the highways that the Federal Highway Act built that divided or destroyed those communities. Can you tell us more about what that means and where you're looking to do this, since so many communities were touched and affected by this?
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is everywhere I go, when I raise this concern that there is often a highway or an interchange or a railway that divides one neighborhood from another, that removed a neighborhood or is even segregating a community, heads nod, and you can just see in people's eyes that they're picturing their community's version of that. This is not something that just happened in the South or just happened in one place or another. We see it everywhere. It happened in Pittsburgh. It happened in St. Paul, Minnesota. It happened in the South as well. Every part. It happened right here in Washington, D.C. And the point here is not to diminish our ability to get around on roads and highways. It's to connect people where infrastructure is doing the opposite of that, which is dividing. The point of transportation infrastructure is to connect, not to divide. And yet in many places it is actually connecting some but dividing others. And the thing that strikes me is, why wouldn't you want us to be dealing with that when we're preparing the vision for the future? Now, there's a lot of different shapes that this can take. In some cases, and again, you're already seeing Atlanta, for example, is working on a project to do just this. Sometimes it's a very intense project where you're going to be capping an entire highway that is running through the heart of a city, putting something over it so that it's connected, and then maybe you have new land that can be used for community use, for park, or for developed. Sometimes it's not going to be as big an intervention as that. It might be more about introducing transit or pedestrian crossings to safely get over or under that railroad or highway. The whole point of this initiative is that it's going to look different in different communities. I'm not going to sit at the DOT headquarters and figure out what's right for every community. We're going to invite them to come to us, to apply to us with their ideas on how this funding could help them get better connected. Because again, everywhere I go, you see this as an issue. The very fact that our American English vocabulary includes the phrase "wrong side of the tracks," which is, of course, a very racially loaded phrase, too. Yes. Tells you everything you need to know about how the infrastructure, whose purpose is to connect, can also serve to divide.
Such a poetic and practical point. More connection, less division. Pete Buttigieg, this is why you're the Secretary of Transportation. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Best of luck in your efforts. We'll be right back.
Thank you.